I'll be honest.
Good afternoon, everybody. We're just going to get going in about another minute. Thanks for joining. Okay. All right, could I ask our wonderful band to, thank you. Sorry, I hate cutting off David Grisman, but welcome everybody. Welcome to the Russian River Friendly Landscape Program community. Thank you all for taking some time out to join us today. We have a pretty exciting agenda and topic to cover. My name is Andy Rogers. I am the Executive Director of the Russian River Watershed Association. The RRWA, as we call it, and its member agencies are proud sponsors of the Russian River Friendly Landscaping Program and today's workshop. Rehydrating the Russian River Watershed, moving toward regenerative landscapes, is a vitally important concept and an objective. And as was alluded to many times yesterday, a call to action. For those of you fortunate enough to attend yesterday, we were guided through an engaging and interactive discussion to explore fundamental linkages of hydrology, soil physics, climate, and your own personal experiences and perspectives, which are all essential elements for moving towards regenerative landscapes. We're genuinely excited for today's continued conversation, and we thank you for joining us. The RRWA was formed in 2003, essentially to collaborate on water projects and initiatives that are regional in scale. The Russian River Friendly Landscape Program is one such initiative. So this is it shows our member agencies covering the entire 1,500 square mile watershed, where lands are half in Mendocino County and the other half in Sonoma County. So collaborating on a watershed scale is essential to achieve regional goals like we're discussing today. The Russian River Friendly Landscape Program, simply put, is to promote landscapes that protect our waterways and support an integrated approach to environmentally friendly landscaping. In 2010, the Russian River Friendly Landscape Guidelines were created, and they were adapted from the San Francisco Bay Friendly Landscape Guidelines developed about 10 years before that. RRFL, Friendly Landscaping, is a whole systems approach to design, construction, and maintenance of landscapes specific to the Russian River watershed. The guidelines are organized around 7 principles for protecting the environment shared on this slide here: nurturing the soil, water and air quality, landscaping locally, conserving water, principles that are definitely part of today's discussion. And within these 7 principles are 53 practices and applications. If you haven't already done so, I encourage you to visit the webpage and download the guidelines for free. You can download those and also see other references that are available that support the Russian River Friendly Landscape Program in English and in Spanish. There's also a signage program that exists that you can apply if you see the sign that's up behind me, and you'll see on most of our literature. This is our contact information, or available if you want to inquire with us about this program or anything RRWA. All right. Yesterday, I provided highlights on the many values of Didi Pershouse, who led us through yesterday's workshop. The values that she brings to our Russian River watershed community are derived from experiences in California and around the world. And I highly encourage you to read her publications, listen and consider her wisdom that she shares with us, and connect with her global network of regenerative thinkers and leaders. So you can find out more about Didi if you listen to yesterday's workshop, which has already been posted on our RRFL webpage, which I posted earlier, and we'll put that in the chat. So if you weren't able to attend yesterday, you can listen into that at your convenience. But today we are our main speaker. Didi will be supporting our main speaker. She's in attendance today and will be chiming in here and there, and also providing some information in parallel with our main speaker through the chat. So pretty exciting. We're getting a lot of support today. But I'm thrilled to be introducing our primary speaker, Mr. Walter Jehne. Walter is an internationally recognized climate scientist, soil microbiologist, and innovative strategist. That's a mouthful. He has immense field and research experience in forests, grasslands, agriculture, and soil and national and international levels. In addition to his science career, Walter has worked broadly with government, leading transformation in industry. The diversity of his experience has given Walter a unique and exceptional capacity to devise solutions to problems and turn challenges into opportunities. He also has a remarkable ability to explain very complex science in easy to understand ways. For all of these reasons and more that you will see soon, we are thrilled to be introducing Walter to speak to you today. Walter, will you take my virtual microphone?
Right. Look, thank you very much, everybody. And thank you for having me all the way from Australia. And obviously for Australia, the driest inhabited continent, water is absolutely critical. And so for the last 50 years, we've been very, very much looking at water and how do we manage water, how do we use it efficiently, and really how do we redesign our biosystems to actually adapt to a drying, aridifying climate, whether that's at the permaculture level, grassroots community activity, or is it even at a scientific, policy level. And so I've been involved with this for a long time. And about 4 years ago, Didi and I, working together in the States, really sort of said, look, this whole hydrology question and solutions to it are fundamental. And at that stage, California was going through a fairly severe drought. I mean, it hasn't changed. The circumstances driving it haven't changed, but obviously the seasons have. But really, we came up with a question of, yes, what would it be needed to actually rehydrate California? How do we actually look at hydrology at a holistic level and saying, what is it that we people have agency over managing the future hydrology, and through that, managing our biosystems, our food security, our cooling of the climate, and just a stable, healthy future. And so that's become a very great interest. Of course, it applies everywhere. We're working together in India and Andhra Pradesh, where the same rehydration of landscape issues is paramount. Globally, we've created over 5 billion hectares of man-made desert and wasteland. aridified land that was previously vegetated and productive. That's about 40% of the land on this planet. And we're continuing and accelerating doing that, especially now with climate change. So this whole question of how do we rehydrate and regenerate landscapes is fundamental. And so while California has that challenge, Australia has a challenge, Andhra Pradesh has a challenge, in a sense, it's one of the fundamentals of global futures. Mark Twain said it very well: whiskey is for drinking, water is for fighting over, but really let's not fight, let's get smart, let's get ahead of the game, and then look at how do we actually rehydrate landscapes at a catchment community level, because it's obviously there where we have agency. Now, I listened into the discussion yesterday and the Q&A feedback and what have you. Basically, what are the issues and challenges that apply locally in terms of getting hold of these rehydration options? And today I'd very much like to look at, right, here are the context, the challenges you've set, but what are some of the practices? What are some of the tools? What are some of these very innovative methods that people around the world are using, applying practically to address their hydrological challenges? What are the case studies? You know, like where have we actually sort of done and achieved, and what are the lessons from them? And I'd like to go through and basically talk about those, those practices, those options, and then perhaps look at how do we actually apply those to at a catchment scale to a particular situation? How do we analyze the situation? And then how do we tailor make solutions to those problems? This is very important because it's not just a prescription, you know, there's no simple recipe book. It's a case of diagnosing, reading the local situation, the limiting factors, and then saying what is it that we can do to intervene to naturally, safely rehydrate, regenerate. The good news is, of course, that yes, we can do this. There's no question whatsoever. Nature has been doing this for basically on land for 420 million years and has repeatedly regenerated, rehydrated landscapes. In fact, nature has that whole biosystem recolonization agenda through exactly these processes we're talking about. It's really through rehydrating or regenerating soils, rehydrating landscapes, that in a sense we have the biosystems that we evolved in and survive on and depend on. And so if we can learn some of these natural processes, how do we use those as tools to go forward? Now, normally when I'm talking, I work with a whiteboard because then I can illustrate, but because we haven't got a whiteboard in this electronic circumstance, I've made a bit of a flip chart here where I've got some of these sort of diagrams which can help visually explain what I'm talking about. So in a minute, I'm going to sort of switch across to those flip charts. But really what we'll go through is we'll go through a series of different hydrological practices, innovation, tools, and we'll go through, okay, how they can be applied at any watershed level. And then basically we're going to sort of like look at all those tools and then say, okay, how do we problem solve with those tools, perhaps addressing some of those key issues that you now have in California, and particularly regarding wildfires and the risk, or well, not the risk, the reality that we're losing biosystems to wildfire as climates progressively aridify. So let me just switch now. So basically I'm going to take it and I'm just going to, oh, hang on. Yep. I'm just going to take the thing back to capture this. Right now, can people see the?
Yes, that's actually, go back a little to the left, just a tiny bit more to the left. Yep, that's perfect.
Perfect, right.
Yeah.
Okay, so basically we start off with this whole situation of context setting. So whenever we get to a landscape, in our case, this is a case study the Murray-Darling Basin, which is about 100 million hectares, that's about 250 million acres in Australia. It's one of our key agricultural zones. And we ask basically, well, what is the hydrology of this region? How do we intervene? The first question we always ask is, well, what happens at the moment to every 100 drops that might fall on that landscape? And if we have 100 drops of rain falling on that landscape, in a sense, how does it partition? What's the processes that happen? And we tend to, well, we try to map this because that gives us a very good indication of, well, where the problems are, where the limits are, but particularly where the potential for intervention and change is. And when we do this, and we've done this at a very senior scientific level, it's really quite profound. Because of the 100 raindrops that fall on any catchment, in fact, we accept that most of it falls on land, on soil. Sure, there's about 2%, 2% of the land, which is hard surface, roads, cities, and so forth. But basically, most landscapes are soil, land. And then what really matters is what happens to that water. Does it actually run off into streams, dams, and then off to sea? Or does it stay in the landscape? And at the moment in our Murray-Darling Basin system, but these figures are pretty much typical all over, they vary a little bit, but some 12 drops out of 100 might end up in our streams. And of those, 2 drops out of 100 are actually able to be stored in our dams. And people really quite get shocked about this. Hang on, 2% of the rainfall ends up in our dams. The World Bank and, basically nations have spent trillions of dollars over the last 70 years building over 50,000 large concrete dams. And even so, they're holding 2 drops out of 100. Worse than that, they're silting up, and so they're progressively losing their effectiveness. And of course, what we've designed is we've designed all our industrial systems on reliance on these dams. So basically 70% of that water is dependent or used in agriculture, irrigated agriculture. Some 20% of the water from those 2 drops out of 100 are used in industry. We often don't understand that even the power generation sector, whether it's nuclear power plants or other power plants, using up to 20% of that water requirement. And about 10% of those 2 drops are used for our urban domestic water needs. So our whole industrial ecology is actually underpinned by these 2 drops out of 100. And of course, they're now very threatened because as climate change intensifies, it's actually aridifying regions. And so, yeah, Southwest US, you may get not the 100 drops, you may get 80 drops. And so then if you've got this partitioning, you're ending up with, 1.5 drops in your dams. So really, we are facing a crisis, but it's wonderful to understand, look, this is a context. This is actually the quantitative distribution. But if we go the other way, we say there's 14 drops out of 100 in our streams and our dams, but 86 drops out of the 100 are still in our soils, or at least fell on our soils. So what happens to them? And a lot depends on the quality, and this is where we were talking yesterday, the quality of the Earth's soil carbon sponge, right? How healthy, how well structured are our soils? Basically, because all this water can infiltrate soils, at the moment in Australia, Murray-Darling Basin, some 36 drops out of the 86, or 36 out of the 100 actually, are actually used by vegetation, native vegetation, as transpiration. And of course, that produces biomass, and of course, is fundamental in cooling the planet. But some 50 drops out of 100 are currently evaporating and getting lost because the lack of soil structure. If we've degraded our soils, compacted our soils, then that water can't infiltrate, it runs off, it puddles, it evaporates, and is effectively lost in a productive way. Whereas in nature, because we did have the sponge, basically that was avoided. You know, like basically most of these, well, the 100 drops ended up in our soils, in our sponge, and then was used by biosystems in a natural, healthy process. And what's so powerful about this analysis, and this applies whether it's the Central Valley, US, or other regions, is there may be some 25 times the water that we're currently dependent on and threatened by that's available in our landscapes, provided we regenerate the Earth's soil carbon sponge. And so for your watershed, the Russian River watershed, this is profound because there's San Francisco, there's California, there's this enormous demand for water, but in a sense, it's the health of your watersheds that is really the critical thing to securing the future, not just of your watershed, but all those other communities dependent. And the point of agency we have in this is, of course, the sponge. And so this is really the key take-home message from yesterday and also from today, is we have agency in regenerating the Earth's soil carbon sponge. It has a profound effect in this whole hydrological dynamic, and it's a sense our opportunity to do that. But dependent on the dams, and even your Hoover Dam, you know, like the California depends on so massively, they're more or less saying we never fill again fully. And so we're really going to be looking at where are we going to store water in the landscape for the future to sustain our well-being. But that's basically the quantitative. We can also look at this now in an economic sense. Now, it looks a little bit noisy at the moment, but let's go and explain it. This
Walter, before you move on, there was one clarifying question about where is the groundwater and that previous.
Oh, okay. The groundwater. Okay, so certainly from that 86 drops out of 100, when we say that's used by biosystems, yes, it can also recharge aquifer groundwaters and then basically be used. So certainly there's leakage to the sea, and there's of course drainage down to aquifers, and then depending on where you are, they can be recycled. Certainly we were looking at, yes, that biosphere layer in that former diagram.
Thank you.
This is now basically coming back to sort of, engineering, landscape architecture, etc., because these are hygrographs, right? And a hygrograph is simply a diagram of what is the relationship between flow, runoff, and time. But it really epitomizes, again, the very, very powerful importance of the sponge and our agency in regenerating the sponge to totally change how water affects us. So this is, in a sense, the impact of water as it is governed by the sponge. And we have just simply two hypothetical, but they pretty much reflect in nature like this. Two soils here. We have a soil which is basically degraded with very low levels of carbon, 0.3% in red. And we have another soil which has got a better level of soil carbon, only 3% carbon, but certainly 10 times soil 1, and that's represented in the green. And you can see very dramatically that there's a fundamental difference in how water reacts or what happens to rainfall. So if we have a storm event, just say 2 inches of rainfall happening in a storm event, if we've got a degraded soil, we end up with this massive flood peak, this very sharp rise, rapid rise in water runoff. But just as quickly, of course, that water runs off and is lost, and it's basically drained. It's as if we had rain on a concrete asphalt road surface. It gets very wet, runs rapidly, and then dries off. And of course, it's in that high flood peak that we end up with all the social costs, because that's where we end up with our flood, the erosion, the water losses, of course, the risk of damage to basically property. Didi yesterday was showing some beautiful, well, not beautiful, they're terrible, slides of basically infrastructure destruction because of flood peaks. And it has a massive cost. So that basically it's the shape of this flood peak that actually governs the social impact of water, the negative social impact of water. But there's something much, much more profound, because we have a flood, by definition, by design, we have more or less effectively designing in a drought, because that water will be lost. And so we have a drought. We end up with more erosion, this time from wind rather than from water. We have biosystems that die. We have the same or even more risk and losses. And effectively, we're turning then a biosystem from what had been a vegetated, healthy, stable system to effectively a desert. And so it's the shape of this flood peak that really dictates the consequences of water, the effects of water. Let's look at the other one. If we have a soil which has got a sponge, in a sense, integrated in it, and this is by no means an optimum soil or the best soil, it's got 3% carbon. Soils will go up to 10% carbon, no troubles. But we end up with a completely different flood peak. So instead of basically it all running off, you'll find that, yes, the starts running off, but then basically it's a buffered, because the water is going into the soil, the water flow is buffered, is stored, it's infiltrated, and you end up with a flood peak that is basically horizontal rather than vertical. And this has a profound difference, because now, in terms of the amount of water that's running off, whereas here we have vast quantities or a large percentage of the water running off, the amount of water running off into the streams, into the dams is much slower. Most of it is getting stored in our in-soil reservoirs. It's available from these soil reservoirs where and when needed by the vegetation. Okay, so then the useful water, you can look at that volume under that graph. Here it is in the degraded soil, a very limited amount of water available for use, whereas once you've got the in-soil reservoirs, you've got most of the water stored in those usable functions. It's similar to the previous thing. Rather than relying on a dam, we're relying on our in-soil reservoirs to store the 86 drops out of 100. But perhaps the most profound thing that then happens, and it's illustrated so beautifully in this graph, is the longevity of green growth that is able to be sustained from this. Okay, whereas before we had a very restricted period over which the soils had enough moisture to sustain growth. So there's a 2-inch rainfall, and yes, we might have active plant growth for 20 days afterwards. Whereas if we infiltrate that soil, recharge our in-soil reservoirs, we can draw that water for 250 days, a tenfold plant biosystem productivity dividend. I mean, that's amazing. You know, like you can put on all the fertilizers, all the interventions you can like in agriculture, you're lucky to get 100% response, whereas a tenfold response is 1,000%. But more than just the productivity, it is this longevity of green growth that gives you resilience. And of course, as we go into climate change, it is resilience of our biosystems, the capacity for our biosystems to buffer these extremes, particularly the hydrological extremes, the ability of those biosystems to survive those extremes, which is the actual profound thing on whether those biosystems survive. So it's a longevity of green growth because of the sponge that is the actual key determinant of health in biosystems and our survival, because we depend entirely on those biosystems. So what we've tried to show in these last two little diagrams is that, yes, look, water is everything. Just as Mark Twain said, you know, water is for fighting over or for really looking after well. And what both of these slides show wonderfully is the critically important of the Earth's soil carbon sponge and our role in regenerating that sponge as the point of agency we have. It's worth mentioning at this point that, in fact, when you think about it, the soil and our management of the soil, and particularly the regeneration of the sponge, is the only point of agency humanity has at a geoplanetary level to affect our climate, to affect our future. Okay, I mean, think of it, that's the only point. It's how nature created the biosystems through building the sponge, and it's our only vehicle, our only point of agency for doing as well. So let's look at how do we actually perhaps do this. And again, Didi sort of went through this briefly in her little diagram, but it's again worthwhile just going through, because it's a basis of life on this terrestrial planet, or life on land. Okay, 420 million years ago, we just had ocean and rock. There was no life on land. You know, life had evolved in the oceans 3.8 billion years ago, but not on land. But 420 million years ago, basically, we had a lot of rock with minerals available in the rock. And obviously, there was a competitive advantage then for life to colonize the land. But rock has got a bulk density. It's very dense, of course, of 2.6 to 3.5 grams per cc, for example. And because it's all fused together, basically it's got no aeration, no water holding capacity, very limited nutrient availability. Obviously, roots can't grow into the rock easily. And obviously, there's no space and voids for microbes to live. So we've more or less got a geologically dead, sterile environment. And it's only then basically by bringing life into this rock, or breaking down, solubilizing and breaking up the rock, putting carbon progressively into the rock and rebuilding the sponge, that we fundamentally change rock into healthy soils. And we do that, and again here, by just putting 3% of carbon in, instead of having the rock compacted and not able to have any of these functionalities, we are actually, if you figuratively look at it, putting bed springs between the little particles, and we end up with this sponge. And we know it's a sponge because the bulk density of healthy soil is 1.2 grams per cc or thereabouts, which is a third or half to a third of what it is in rock. So basically 2/3 of a healthy soil is actually made up of nothing, of just air. Okay, so to make a healthy soil, what you have to do is add nothing. Okay, and that's a bit challenging because people have a problem to how do they sell that to you, you know, like how do they actually, yes, sell you nothing for you to increase the health of your soil. But all you have to do is add that carbon, because then you create these voids, these matrices, these cathedrals of microbial spaces in the soil. And it's those spaces, those nothing, that actually gives you the aeration, the water holding capacity, the ability for roots to proliferate throughout that matrix and therefore exploit that soil. And of course, basically also the nutrient availability, which is related to the surface area exposure and hence the availability of those nutrients to the microbes, which then of course have the habitat. So all the characteristics of a healthy soil, whether it's aeration, water holding capacity, biofertility, rootability, microbial ecology, all created by just putting this 3% carbon, these bed springs in between the mineral matrix, and adding nothing, just adding voids. And that's how nature actually created our biosystems, turned sterile, dead rock into highly productive biosystems. And of course, that's exactly what we can and must do to regenerate our soils. But it's also, of course, practically very important, because for landscape architects, for example, these are the tools that we use. We just simply say, how do we put more carbon in the soils? And through that, all these dividends will flow naturally. And basically, that's the challenge and opportunity from regenerating our soils, our landscapes, our watersheds. Just, putting that carbon in the soils, but then reaping the dividends in terms of hydrology, what we looked at. So then we come to the question, well, look, how do we actually put this carbon back into the soil? Okay, how do we actually regenerate healthy soils from degraded soils or even from primary rock? And of course, it's again very simple. We do it just as nature did. I mean, look at nature. 9,000 years ago, America, you had glacial outwash till, waterlogged, compacted, degraded mineral detritus, basically coming from the glaciers. And in the last 9,000 years, nature, through plants, has turned that into 10-meter deep prairie soils, some of the most bioproductive soils on this planet, sustaining very, very productive, healthy, or used to be before we came along, very healthy biosystems. And so the question is, how did nature do it? And it's very, very simple. And we say it's as simple as ABC, because it's all about it's about agriculture, it's about plants, and it's just simply using photosynthesis to fix carbon dioxide with water, sunlight, to make sugars, biomass. And really, it's that simple. It's just maximizing plant growth, maximizing biomass growth to create sugars. And that's, in a sense, a simple driver, and nature's given it to us in plenty, both in terms of area, longevity, and rate. Yes, we can do that. We're quite masterful at that. But what's important isn't just it's not just how much we can grow through agriculture, but we must. But really what's more subtle and much more important is what happens to every gram of carbon biomass that we do produce. Do we actually let it burn or oxidize straight back to CO2? Or do we turn it into stable soil carbon? Now, the profound thing is that all through history of life on this planet, there's only two things that can happen to any molecule of carbon that's fixed through photosynthesis. It can either burn or turned into stable soil carbon. It's B or C. Okay, it doesn't have an option. And so really it's that balance between B and C, which is our point of agency. Do we let whatever we produce as A burn, or do we turn it into stable soil carbon? Now, we're already ahead of the game, because when you look at a plant, 30% of the biomass is above the ground. It's where we live, what we can see. But what we can't see is that 30% is, again, roughly in the roots, but another 40% is in root exudates. So there's already 70% of the carbon deposited by nature down under, in the soils below the ground. And so the question is really not that we can't use some of it in oxidation. Obviously we do, because of respiration is burning that all the time. But what's the ratio? And at the moment, you see, we've got an industrial agriculture that is turning some 120% of A continually into B. It's basically all the biomass produced in agriculture on an annual basis, plus so much of our heritage, fossil fuel, fossil carbon, former sequestered carbon. We're just oxidizing it back to CO2. And of course, that's what we're seeing in our Charles Keeling curve, the whole CO2 crisis. And of course, we do that because we've got very, very oxidative, excessively oxidative agricultural practices that we use to try and stimulate A. We burn and clear, we cultivate, we over-fertilize, we use biocides, we use bare fallows, and all of those things are actually driving carbon out of the soil into CO2 and giving us this net loss of carbon, this net oxidation. And obviously, it's as simple as do less bad, right? Do no harm. You know, don't do these silly things. I mean, because if we just slow down on doing those negative things, by default, we're going to have that carbon turned by microbes basically into humates and glomalin, stable soil carbon. Okay, so it's actually managing the soil, not driving it towards oxidation, but driving it more towards humidification, you know, humus production. There's already basically, as we say, 90% of the root exudates can go into humus, most of the roots can, so much the litter can. So nature's already got it loaded in our favor, or in its favor, to basically build up to 10 tons of carbon per hectare per annum sustainably into soils. And that's in a sense what we need to regenerate the Earth's soil carbon sponge to get that 3% carbon back into soils. And of course, there's a whole lot of very simple practice, simple natural practices, whether it's composting, whether it's mulching, to accelerate this process, but also restore this balance between B and C. What's so powerful though then, and we've seen that in the previous graph, isn't just B and C, but actually it's D. It's the dividends. It's the dividends that are delivered automatically in a positive feedback processes once we do C. Because it's basically the sponge and the carbon in the soil, as we saw, that gives us the water potential, the nutrient availability, the rootability of those soils, its microbial ecology, and basically its resistance to disease and pest outbreaks, because we've got much, much healthier plants. It's this D that gives us basically the productivity and resilience of that biosystem. And basically, the other profound thing is if we have these dividends working on our behalf, because we've got soil carbon, then we can maximize, as nature does, the productivity of agriculture. And we don't need any of these oxidative inputs. So we built an agricultural system which ignored everything below the ground, where we're saying we need to have these oxidative inputs to keep agriculture going. Whereas in nature, it goes the other way to say, look, no, we get all these supports for plant growth from the soil carbon sponge, from D, and therefore we don't need B. Okay, so this is the basis like Vijay Kumar in Andhra Pradesh, our colleague in India, zero budget natural farming, where he's getting higher yields, more reliable yields with minimal inputs, because he's rebuilding the sponge and the dividends that are coming from the sponge. So quite profound, but so simple and so profitable and so natural. And it's just a matter then looking at practices to say, right, let's do less harm, less oxidative damage to our soils, switch it more to microbial fixation of that biomass carbon into stable soil carbon, and we collect the dividends automatically. Okay, so basically that's the key part of regenerating the Earth's soil carbon sponge, and then its hydrology. Basically, when we're now coming back to sort of rehydrating landscapes, and it's reflected here as well partly, we've got another issue to say, well, look, how do we actually get maximum water both in the soil, but then how do we get maximum use of that water? It came up partly in the question about recharging aquifers. So how do we then use that water most efficiently? And obviously the answer is yes, by maximizing the root proliferation, because we've got that here, by maximizing root proliferation to depth, we're able to draw on that whole in-soil reservoir volume of water. And this is, again, amazingly profound in terms of scale. At the moment, we're growing agricultural plants. Most of the roots are 20 centimeters or so, using the top 20 centimeters, because that's where we irrigate, that's where we fertilize. So we're using 20 centimeters of soil, whereas nature will use 4 meters of soil. So the volume of soil that's available for water holding, nutrient availability, microbial proliferation is profoundly increased. So again, it's the actual three-dimensional volume of soil that we are utilizing, which gives us one of the key issues in productivity, water use efficiency. Another area that we can actually then to say, look, how do we maximize water in our soils is saying, okay, how do we minimize the losses? And again, there's a lot of discussion. I don't want to go into too much today, but obviously we use cover crops, we use mulches. And so that avoids evaporation. And so remember on the first diagram, we had the situation where here we had 50 drops out of 100 evaporating. Well, we don't need to evaporate them. If we have cover crops on those soils, if we have shelter woods on those soils, if we restore our small water cycles on those landscapes, then a lot of those 50 drops can be then put back into the biosystem. And so we end up with 70 or more of those water drops being used in biosystems rather than being lost by evaporation. So there's a whole lot of water use efficiency measures that we can actually use to use that water from the in-soil reservoirs in a more profound way. But there's another challenge that we've had, and for the last 10,000 years, our agriculture has been pretty primitive in a way, because yes, we had these forests with deep roots and very productive natural systems. And to grow crops, we sort of found that, look, we had to actually destroy these natural systems to create niches in time and space, short periods of time and space, so we could opportunistically grow crops that we could then use for food plants. So our whole concept of shifting cultivation was to clear a bit of jungle, burn the jungle, create a space of fertile, mineral-enriched soils for a short period, and then rapidly grow some cassava or some yams and have 1 or 2 harvests before the jungle took over again. And we still do that now. So most of our oxidative destructive agriculture, all the oxidative inputs are all about killing natural systems. So we create soils and spaces for growing our crop plants. And we do that because nature is in fact far, far more efficient and competitive than we are. And if we try to coexist with nature, it's bloody hard. It's very, very difficult because nature ends up with 90% of the goodies. And of course, that's so typical in gardening or in village agriculture, urban agriculture. Because basically, I would say that 90% of the water we put onto our agricultural gardening plants, 90% of the fertilizers we put on aren't used by the plants we're trying to grow. They're used by the roots of the trees and the fungi from those trees that are colonizing this soil and will outcompete our little vegetables or whatever we're trying to grow anytime. And that's been the whole problem. How do we actually create gardens, productive gardens in competition with these more aggressive natural biosystems? And so to counter that and to overcome that, well, we've had 2 strategies. We've had, and I used to work with Bill Mollison quite a bit in permaculture, where we say, look, we can't beat them. Can we join them? Can we design food forests? And of course we can, and that's successful in its very clever ways. So that's very good. But the second thing is to say, can we actually separate physically our gardens and our food production from these much more competitive natural ecosystems? And this is where these concepts of wicking bags come in. And they're so simple. They're a couple of cents worth of recycled, reusable plastic. And what we do is we have a bag which is about 70 centimeters cubed, right? So it's a bit under cubic yard of soil. But what we have below that is actually a layer where we actually have a water storage layer. It's supported then by bottles, just laying flat bottles. And then we have soil above that, and we have a mulch layer, and everything is watered from below. So these wicking bags are basically dependent on this water in the layer below, wicking up through the soil. There's no watering on the surface because that just encourages weeds to grow. It's all protected by mulch, but we can water that lower layer with grey water simply through a tube going into the base of the layer. But the powerful thing about this, because this is a sealed layer, it's actually separate from the roots and the mycorrhizal fungi that are, in a sense, otherwise competing and exploiting that soil, that would otherwise be getting 90% plus of the water, 90% plus of the nutrients, and making that soil almost impossible to grow vegetables in. And so these wicking bags actually have become quite profound because they can give us then a 10-fold water use efficiency, a 10-fold nutrient use efficiency for these agricultural ecosystems. Okay, and so from an urban village farming point of view, we can massively increase the productivity of growing healthy, green, nutritious food plants for people in a much more limited space, in a very much controlled environment, without this threat of competition from below. Better than that, we can actually grow these things under the shelter of trees and what have you, without those trees actually totally dominating that food production capacity of this thing. Just as importantly, we can actually now say, look, here is soil sovereignty, which is socially a profoundly important thing, because this is actually empowering people with their own land. Okay, the soil in this wicking bag, it's made from degraded subsoil plus compost, but it becomes soil belonging to the owner of the bag. It's no longer basically, like I'm leasing land, or it's the landed and the non-landed that have got a power hierarchy. You are empowering yourself because you have your own soil, your own food, nutritional autonomy. So this becomes quite an important, powerful social instrument. And for example, in, developing countries and stuff, but also now cities, and over 70% of people will be living in cities within decades, it's giving us the empowerment to say, yes, we can have a green urban forest, but we can also grow healthy, nutritious green food in there through these sorts of innovative, very efficient water use innovations. And of course, really change the whole basis of both agriculture, food security, but also preventative health. It's also, of course, I haven't drawn that into here, but actually we can use these to actually recycle a lot of our organic wastes and what have you. So all the kitchen scraps and stuff, they can be integrated here in a vermiculture system. So we're just adding grey water, wastewater, food scraps in controlled vermiculture situations to really build microcosms, spaceships, productive spaceships producing our food. The power of these things, though, is in its water use efficiency, because here we have a point of agency of 10 times water use efficiency compared to conventional systems. Okay, so that's water use efficiency, whether it's cover crops, shelter woods, or innovations like these wicking bags. I now wanted to really talk about another big challenge we've got, which in a sense we need to address rapidly, and that's these 5 billion hectares of man-made desert and wasteland that we've created through our agriculture. And in a
Walter,
sense...
can I interrupt you for a moment?
Please.
I see some folks that are having questions. They don't understand the water mechanism at the bottom.
The water mechanism here. Okay, well, basically you've got roots from the plants growing down into the water, and you've got water wicking up from these lower layers, basically through capillary action up into the soil. But the whole thing is driven from watering from below. So you're not actually adding water at the surface, which then risks evaporating, but also just fostering weed growth, right? But look, it's just a closed system, and it's really just, yeah, the idea of watering from below, but most importantly, not allowing that water to be lost from that system, because of course there's a sealed plastic membrane stopping the water leaking out, getting lost, but also stopping the roots of the mycorrhizal fungi, etc., roots of mycorrhizal fungi parasitizing, colonizing, exploiting that resource. Okay. Basically, but coming back to the other thing as far as now, so we've got this big challenge of how do we actually rehydrate and regenerate and really bring back into productive food production some of these 5 billion hectares of man-made desert and wasteland. And of course, that's absolutely critical for you guys in California as well, because, you know, like it's your neighboring states, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, where you can really see its aridification is biting so hard. And so how do you prevent those areas going to total deserts, but also those desert environments encroaching more and more into, for example, the Central Valley? And so the big issue here is that we have seen water in our Western industrial agricultural system very much as we've seen before in the first one, in terms of the water in our dams, you know, the raindrops and the water in our dams. What we don't see, because we can't see, is the actual water in the air, the aerial water. Air contains up to 50,000 parts per million, up to 5% by weight of water as water vapor. And this aerial water flows right across the planet continually, across all the world's deserts continually. And basically, it's basically a blue planet awash with water, not just in the oceans, not just in the rain, but in this 50,000 parts per million of aerial water circulating the planet all the time. And of course, nature hasn't wasted this. Nature sort of says, look, I can use all that water. Now, sure, it's not as quantitatively as large as the rain or the oceans, but if they're strategic and intelligent, they can make use of that water. And it does, you see. And so we in Australia, you know, the driest inhabited continent, basically we've got vast areas of desert, but 95% of our deserts are still green. They're still vegetated. They still have plants, because for the last 40 million years, these plants have evolved extremely efficient, exquisite ecologies for harvesting some of this aerial water. And so we have things like, well, you too, you have cactuses down in, you know, like Arizona. And again, they're harvesting, sucking up that water hygroscopically from the air. We've got salt bushes again, and the salt's hygroscopic, absorbs water from the air. Where you are, you've got, you know, your sequoia forest, your coastal redwood forest. 70% of their moisture for those sustaining those forests is coming from the fogs and mist that come in every day or most days from the Pacific Ocean. So these enormous efficient aerial water sources that we've never actually looked at in agriculture, can we design much more water efficient systems using these aerial sources? And of course, the potential is, yes, we can. And how do we actually then design plants, but environments where we can actually use those water sources? And as we say, look,
when you get the chance, Walter, there's a few questions that are coming up that I think might be good before we keep going, but finish your thought there.
Yeah, okay. So basically it's that question of, here's this whole other dimension, a whole opportunity for water utilization. and then what are the practical solutions that we can basically use to harvest that water. And okay, well let's ask the questions then, right? Mm-hmm.
Okay, so one person is asking, is the speaker suggesting that much of Arizona and Nevada would not be desert were it not for human abuse of the land?
Well, look, no, that's a little bit black and white. No, it would be arid zone because it's in that Mediterranean climate, it's in that zone. But the point is it is still getting plenty of water from the air. And yes, it would be able to naturally it would evolve and had evolved basically a dryland savanna ecosystem, again, which was exquisitely effective at harvesting water, including, for example, through the cacti. The other thing that we're finding in Australia.
Oh, you've cut out for just a moment. Usually it seems to come back in a minute.
There's whole planet harvesting water. You know, they're actually harvesting water every night, and the soils under these places are actually quite wet, but they're obviously saline. You know, but the point is that then, yes, we're harvesting water, but it's salt water. But then the answer is what plants or are plants, or particularly mycorrhizal fungi, able to use some of this water? And the answer is yes, they can. So it's basically. So it's not just fresh water, it's basically saying, look, here's salt, and salt in these desert areas being used actually as part of that harvesting strategy. So there's a whole sequence of strategies that nature uses. Another one is actually the different foliage. So if you look at Cupressus arizonica, for example, which is your cypress from Arizona, obviously, and its foliage is exquisitely designed to, again, condense and capture and harvest water from these humid airflows. So you'll find that these desert plants, these desert trees, are wonderfully adapted to actually harvesting water. And actually, I'll just jump ahead a bit because it's in a different thing. Here it is. And of course, we can talk about this basically in the concept of ridge plantings and dew ponds. Now, the Celts in Ireland and Scotland, they perfected some exquisite hydrological technologies where they basically created dew ponds in the saddles on ridge tops. And of course, everyone says that's impossible because water runs downhill and we expect water down here in the streams. What's the water doing up in these dew ponds? And of course, what happens, you get humid air flows from the Atlantic Ocean, you know, on their coastal areas. And of course, as that humid air flows up these hills, it builds up pressure. And of course, it takes more water into it from the transpiration of the vegetation. So you build up these humid air flows under reasonably high pressures, but when that air flows over the top of the ridge, then you end up with a low pressure area on the lee side of the ridge. And of course, as you go into from high pressure into low pressure, by definition, that air cools. And of course, as that air cools, it has to get rid of the water. It can't hold that water. So it has to condense that water. So it condenses it all on those ridge forests and those ridge vegetation, and that basically runs in and fills up these dew ponds. And so you had these dew ponds which were constantly basically filled and recharged with water every night. And of course, the nice thing that's where the sheep and the animals then at nighttime would come up because they'd be camping on the top of the hill because that was warmer than it down in the frost hollows below. They had their water, they grazed, but they, of course, also defecated up on top of the hill, which made that whole nutritional cycle, you know, harvesting nutrients from right across the biosystem, bringing it up into a higher landscape, allowing those nutrients to flow down through the system. The dew ponds were also very powerful in subsoil hydrostatic recharge. Okay, so by constantly, I mean, they weren't impervious, so by basically seeping out from these dew ponds, you would have a hydrostatic subsoil water recharge, and that would of course burst out at springs where there were geological or soil barriers, or sort of situations that foster these springs. And so the whole hydration of the landscape was again based, I mean, obviously there was rainfall as well, but basically these dew harvesting hydrostatic recharge systems helped rehydrate that whole landscape. Now, this is very, very similar to what, of course, happened in California, where you had a coastal range with a lot of native oak forests, savanna oak forest. And again, that oak forest was harvesting this water, basically putting it into the soils, recharging it down. You had then the Central Valley, and then you had the Sierra Nevada, which again had exactly the same high pressure to low pressure, then condensation, and of course all the snow melt, all the snowpack on the Sierra Nevada was all based on these humid airflows depositing all that moisture on the top of Sierra Nevadas. And of course that was then your water reservoir. You had enormous water reservoirs in your snowpack, which slowly melted and recharged and made that Central Valley absolutely a wonderful mesic series of wetlands. And well, when the Spanish came there 350 years ago, paradise, wildfire, wetlands, waterfowl, it's just wonderful. And of course, exactly the same principle, but it's all basically based on harvesting aerial water. And then you've got to ask yourself, well, what have we done to that? What have we done as we've cleared these forests, as we've degraded these soils, as we brought in, we talked about it yesterday, more fire-prone eucalypts instead of these. So are we getting anything like those fog drifts, fog mists, fog harvesting? And the same with the Sierra Nevadas. Are we getting the snowpack that we used to get? Sure, it's getting warmer, but more importantly, are the moist, humid airflows from the Pacific Ocean basically coming across the land and depositing as they did before? And then the question is, what level of vegetation disturbance has created this aridification, but also what level of regeneration can rebuild this hydrology? Okay, well, any questions around that in case I'm going too fast or too complicated?
Well, I think I just wanted to let you know that we have about 25 minutes left, or 20 minutes left. And so
in total.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, I better hurry up then.
Well, so we could. Not sure what else there was. What else is coming up? But
no. Look,
there's lots of questions, and I think anything that could be very speaking directly about either what we've seen with dry sowing in India could be really helpful.
Yeah. No, look. Okay. So
know about some very specific projects might be great.
Yeah, well, look, yes, and of course it comes into then further sort of details. Okay, so that was the aerial rivers or the aerial water, but there's also a whole lot of microscopic water that, again, we don't appreciate. One of the first things is that actually, plants take up water, fungi take up water, but they take up water in completely different ways. See, whereas plants can take up water just from the soil solution, just from the capillary water around soil particles that's held up to wilting point tensions. Basically, fungi can take that water up as well, of course, but then they can go much, much further because they can also take up water from these what otherwise are unavailable films around all the mineral particles, because they've got such an intimate association growing on those surfaces, but also they've got the capacity to absorb that water at wilting point tensions 3-4 times that of plant. And of course, therefore, they're able to source water from these arid areas, dehydrated soils, basically much, much more efficiently than plants can. And of course, this is profoundly important in deserts. The volumes of water aren't enormous, but in fact, the role of that water in enabling these plants to survive in deserts is profound. So there's one source of then microbial water. Another source, which again, we basically, and I've got that in a slide back here. Yeah, we'll come back to this later, that we can see at the bottom here. This is again, also profound. We know that when we have photosynthesis, when we create organic matter, we have sunshine, 6 grams of CO2, 6 grams of water to create a gram of organic matter. And that's just simple biochemistry. It's fundamental. But what we don't often recognize is that when we break down a gram of organic matter through respiration, through the fungi, we are basically, generating 6 grams of CO2 back again, but we also generate 6 grams of water. And so there's what they call metabolic water or biochemical water that is generated simply through this respiration process. And so where we have a compost heap or organic matter breaking down, fungi breaking down organic matter, it's in a sense generating metabolic water. And that metabolic water, while again, it isn't vast volumes, not flood quantities, it is absolutely critical in arid zones for enabling plants to germinate, establish, and survive. And so we're now using this metabolic water, these mycorrhizal fungal water uptake processes and water harvesting systems, basically, using these water systems to say, look, used strategically, we can actually grow plants in arid areas, we can rehydrate, we can regenerate vast areas of these 5 billion hectares of man-made desert and wasteland. And that, of course, globally has a profound effect, not just in regreening the planet, but actually cooling the planet. But perhaps we won't go into that so much. Now, look, there's a whole series of other processes, obviously, I could go into, but I just wanted to come quickly perhaps to what I wanted to not conclude on, but draw together. So really say now, right, you guys in your Russian River watershed, what are the issues you're facing? And really, we all are facing globally this issue now of wildfires, right? Because these wildfires aren't just fires, these are actually the oxidation of biosystems as climate extremes intensify. This is the collapse of biosystems, and it's happening, through wildfires everywhere, whether it's Greece, Alaska, basically Mount McMurray in Canada, California, Australia, everywhere. And these are biosystems that are actually being now desertified and aridified back to deserts because of climate change and our management. So we've got to turn this around, right? Because if we lose these biosystems, we lose the economies, the communities that are totally dependent on them. And so what we've been doing in Australia, looking at this, is to say, look, okay, what is it that nature does to limit these fires? And we have a fundamental ecology here of fire versus fungi. You see, basically, we either oxidize everything, or going back to the B and C, we either oxidize everything or we can go into stable soil carbon. And nature actually did this by saying, look, here's all this wildfire fuel, but I can turn all that fuel into stable soil carbon plus water. And in doing so, I can fundamentally have biological fire risk minimization, fire breaks. So what we're doing in Australia now, we're looking at, okay, how do we design ecological fuel management strategies that are dependent on these fungi, accelerating these activities, these fungi, and how do we do that over perhaps 1 or 0.5% of the area of the catchment to protect the whole catchment? And what we do is we basically take that litter from just say fire trails and roads, and we create these linear longitudinal swales at the downside of those roads. We then basically biostimulate the fungal activity in them to turn all what had been fuel into now a humate, basically into humus, but also water. So we end up with this actually moist zone of non-combustible humates. And from that zone, we can actually have a fire break from which we can safely backburn to isolate the fire. And this is just a little map where you might say, look, here's a catchment, town, roads, creeks, but here's, in a sense, these biological fire swales. And if there was a lightning ignition point, we would then be able to come in very rapidly, backburn from these biological fire breaks to isolate, that fire, that risky wildfire to that little area, rather than allowing it to spread, over millions of hectares, as is happening in Australia under the current practices. So this whole question of, can we actually go to catchment fire risk reduction strategies using these biological fire breaks and basically extinction possibilities. So that's really where we're talking about all these rehydration and these natural hydrological processes. But what we're really trying to epitomize here is, yes, these are the problem-solving applications, right? We've got a fundamental threat, wildfires. So how do we actually intelligently use and design and tailor-make these hydrological solutions to basically try to do this risk minimization? And that's, in a sense, where we're at the moment. Look, just concluding very rapidly, I'm with a little organization called Regenerative, and it's all about basically cooling the planet safely and naturally. And again, it gets to the whole heart of the thing. We talked about why the sponge is so important. Now the question is, right, we've got to build the sponge at scale everywhere on the planet. And the bottom line is, yeah, we can draw down 20 billion tons of carbon per annum globally back into the soil carbon sponge. And if we could do that, obviously that's then our only chance now to avoid this accelerating climate degradation, because through that we could rebuild biosystems and cool the planet naturally hydrologically. And it's very much a simple thing. At the moment, we've been so focused on, yes, we've got this 10 billion tons of carbon a year deficit. We've got 8 billion tons of that deficit is being contributed by fossil fuel. And that's, in a sense, where our whole climate debate is focused on, in a sense, like, yes, here's our deficit, here's our fossil fuel use. We've got to stop fossil fuels to get rid of this deficit. But what we don't see is what Charles Keeling showed us in 1958, that there's 130 billion tons of carbon a year that is emitted. There's about 120 billion tons of carbon a year that is drawn down again. And we have, through these hydrological regeneration processes, enormous opportunities to both reduce these emissions, such as through wildfires, and to regenerate biosystems to draw down carbon. So there is no question that we could easily reach that 20 billion tons carbon global target through these regenerate Earth, these natural regeneration processes. But the key thing isn't the carbon accounting. The key thing is putting it into the sponge, because it's only that sponge that will give us the hydrology, that will give us the cooling. And we haven't talked about that, but that's the bigger subject anyway. How do we hydrologically naturally cool the planet? We can, but it's only the sponge that can do that. So really, thank you very much. And let's get into the questions. Right.
Great. And I've just just learned that actually we are right on time, because we still have about 40 minutes left. We had miscalculated how long today was. It's 2 hours, not an hour and a half.
Oh, so, okay. Well, wonderful. Well,
so
look, yeah, we can come back.
But I think it might be good. Yeah, let's go to a few questions first, yes, and we'll take a little. Take a little stretch break. So why don't we take 2 or 3 minutes for people to get up, get some water in, water out, that metabolic water cycling that we were just talking about.
Yeah.
And Andy can put some music on, and we'll come back and take some questions. So
yeah, but we're about not wasting this antibiotic water, metabolic water, so people have to be careful what they do with it, right?
Right, step outside.
Yeah, you say hi to a tree, right?
So if folks want to post some questions in the chat, that would be great. Remember that as I was talking about yesterday, that really framing a good question is more important than getting it answered today. It's really a good challenge for us to keep asking more and more complete, interesting questions and getting more and more of us involved in thinking about them and answering them. So see you back in a few minutes. Welcome back, everyone. And there are a few questions coming in the chat, and I'm wondering, Thomas also has questions from yesterday gathered in one spot. So if there are ones that we didn't address today that didn't get addressed, we can also look through some of those as well. So let's see here. I think we have, if other folks are, yeah, my scrolling up through the chat is a little tricky here. So Thomas, if you're keeping track there and want to jump in with a question or two, that would be great.
Hello, everybody. I hope you can see me and not the bedroom behind me. Yes, good. My virtual background is on. That's fabulous. My bed is somewhere back there. So there were some wonderful questions yesterday, which we didn't really get to ask many of out loud. And so Didi, as you're gathering the ones from today, just jump in whenever you're ready. So some of the ones that I was hoping to raise up yesterday talk about how, enhancing the soil sponge is, our critical challenge. How do we engineer the transition of introducing diverse natives that will thrive and withstand threats from invaders, thistles, Scotch broom, and expanding coyote brush? That was one of them. I'm just going to list off a couple of them, and then Walter and Didi can choose what to do with them. One of them was how to convince landscapers and property managers not to install synthetic weed cloth. One of them was, talking about natives again with Scotch broom. Since it's not native, would we really want it to grow in burned areas? There were a lot more questions about kind of mulch and fire. I'll pause there in case you want to respond to any of those.
Yeah, look, thank you very much, Thomas. And this is, a little bit what we went into, didn't get to specifically native, non-native, but what I said with ABC, the bottom line, nature doesn't discriminate, right? It doesn't care what color or what shape you are. It's a plant, it's photosynthesizing, it's putting down carbon. What we call weeds are plants that are particularly competitive. That's why they are weeds, because they're doing more than what we expected. And we are threatened by them because they're very aggressive and very competitive in that situation at that time. And that's because they're well adapted to that degraded site that they're colonizing. But by definition, this is right across ecology, by growing in that site, by putting in roots and root exudates and microbial ecology, they are changing that site, and they will change that site to exclude themselves. Okay, there's no plant that has taken over this planet, right? There are literally millions of plants and all have their niche and all have their successional stage. And there's no such thing as a weed in nature. It is just a plant, the right plant at the right time, doing the right thing to improve that soil. And a weed is something we define philosophically as a plant in the wrong place. And it's our minds that have got the problem, not the plants. And so take about Scotch broom to say, look, it's a wonderful nitrogen fixing plant. Yes, it's not palatable and so forth because it can survive. Otherwise, anything that is palatable will be eaten, but it can survive. It can put down deep tap roots, strong soil building tap roots, nitrogen fixing rhizobia. and is rebuilding that soil after fire, after degradation. And then as it builds, it will be outcompeted. So I think we've got to really ask ourselves to say, look, let's look at this thing ecologically. Now, fair enough, we may not want to spread this plant. And for example, we don't have to, because the answer is, do we harvest it before it flowers, before it sets seeds? For example, thistles, wonderful plant, deep, strong tap roots, enormously powerful at regenerating soils. Sure, we don't want them to set seeds, so do we actually mulch them or roll them or whatever before they set seed? So there's, first of all, it's our labeling of these plants as weeds, and secondly, our mismanagement of them. But if we can get both of those things done, we've got to ask yourself, what's the problem? Are they actually helping us, or are we just the problem ourselves?
Ah, I see. That's a very interesting way to talk about that. I think I'll not dive in, but I know that that's a very kind of controversial subject with.
Yeah, and of course, the other side of it, I mean, it's not a neutral game. There's literally a multi-billion-dollar industry selling herbicides to kill these things, right? And they've got a vested interest in promoting it as well.
Yeah, just, you know, that there are. I'll leave it. I'll leave it there. Didi, did you have something to jump in, or should I pull some more things from yesterday?
Go ahead and keep going from yesterday. That's fine. And I'm searching back up through the chat here for things that didn't already get. A lot of it's gotten addressed through conversation between people, which is what I was recommending, is that we are all experts here. There's a tremendous amount of knowledge just from the few people that I do know who are here. I expect that's true of everybody here, that everyone has experience and people are answering each other's questions quite well here. So carry on.
Yeah, I know that there had been a question earlier also about kind of on a smaller scale, like even for an urban landscape, somebody's yard, like what are the things that really are the most impactful on that scale? Have we addressed that sufficiently today already? I've been kind of jumping in and out.
Look, very much, Thomas, and this is exactly where that whole concept of the wicking bag comes in, right? Because we will have 70% of humanity living in urban sort of settings with very restricted area, but often no rights to the soil because they're leasing or, you know, renting or whatever. And so the point is, how do we empower those people to get involved in the soil, invested in the soil, with soil, but also in their own preventative health through growing nutritious food and actually closing nutrient wastewater cycles locally, because we've got to do that for just to keep the cycles going. And so these wicking bags are really part of that, because this is actually sovereign soil. This is their land that they're generating themselves. And basically, you know, a dozen wicking bags in a courtyard, on a balcony, as an edge and a terrace, it's all doable and it's all mobile and transportable and what have you. So it's really a new dimension of urban agriculture, both in terms of its water use efficiency, its nutrient efficiency, but just having soil that, or land that is now adapted to this urban, you know, future environment. So, I mean, again, there's a whole lot of beautiful landscape architecture and permaculture design applications we could go through. How would you use them? But it's really a bit of a breakthrough technology that enables us to do where otherwise we were back to shifting cultivation, having to kill a forest so we could try and grow a few vegetables.
There's one of the things that came up in the chat today was that in the California climate, the rain stops just as the growing season starts. And so therefore, the landscapes or soils are not going to stay green very long, even if they're healthy.
Yeah, and look, that's again, just very quickly, I see, look, very much, I mean, yes, but if you've basically infiltrated that rain through your sponge, stored it in your in-soil reservoirs, had longevity of green from that storage in the reservoirs, no, you've got 200 days of green growth even when it's not raining. And that's what we're doing in Andhra Pradesh, right? Because again, it's a monsoonal, seasonal, 75% dry, arid, very hot, very inhospitable, 25% torrential rain. And how do you actually create the sponge, the reservoirs, the buffering, so you can extend to 365 days green growth on those habitats?
Yeah, and I wanted to highlight a few things that also came up in the chat. Yes, it's not just about keeping plants growing, it's actually the diversity itself. Those relationships between plants and between different families and species of plants are really key to a resilient landscape. And one of the ways I like to think about it is that as healthy as carrots are, if I only ate carrots all day long, I wouldn't be able to stay healthy. And that's because the microbes in my gut that produce my brain chemicals that help extract nutrients from things, et cetera, so that my immune system is working, they need that different microbes need different foods, and I need that diverse community inside my body, which I can only have that if I feed a diversity of food. So in a soil system, by having diverse plants, you are feeding diverse sugars, exudates, things into the soil, attracting different microbial communities. And by microbial, we mean fungal and bacterial, as well as a lot of other little soil critters. So having that diversity is something that we're really only just starting to understand what that does to a system. And farming has been so monocropped, and so have lawns, that we haven't seen what's possible, I think, until we start changing that up.
Absolutely. And just add to that, it's also the synergies, like basically how different plants growing together all complement each other, reinforce each other in terms of solubilization of nutrients, root utilization, etc. So, it's 1 and 1 equals 4 rather than they're competitive. They're often very synergistically and beneficial. The other thing, coming back to the health thing, is, and coming back to the weeds thing, yes, there's basically herbivores that are browsing this stuff all the time. And they're picking up from the weeds all these different diverse plants, and that's where they're getting their whole micronutrient, nutritional complement for their own health and for our health.
Yeah, I actually wanted to just show something here. See if I can share my screen. So these are a couple of the slides that we didn't fully get to yesterday. This is actually from John Kemp, and he had an interesting article, I think, that came out today about how healthy crops don't rot, they dehydrate. And he had an apple and an orange and something else that had been sitting on his counter for a year, I think. That were dried out, and I've seen that myself when I'm buying food from a farm that's really paying attention to soil health. As the plants can get more nutrients from the soil through these relationships with each other and with their symbionts in the soil. This is hard to read here, but what you're seeing is that each of these levels of plant health, which comes from those soil relationships, gives resistance to the plant against different levels of diseases. So let's see if I can get this. I don't know if people can see it all, but it's starting with fungal pathogens, and then moving up to insects with simple digestive systems, let's see. Then a whole bunch of all of the airborne fungal and bacterial pathogens when you get up to lipid or fat synthesis, and then resistance to the entire beetle family as you come up. Now, plants, and we haven't even gotten into viruses here, but when we eat those plants and they have those aromatic new flavors and all of that terroir that we talk about with the food that's grown so beautifully in different places with different relationships in the soil, we're getting a lot of those benefits, and we develop those resistances to bacterial and fungal, viral, et cetera, and even to perhaps we're fending off the insects. So I don't know if you know, there's some people, oh, mosquitoes never bother me, or I have a friend who, ticks latch on and then die right on him. I mean, there's something in what certain people are eating that gives us tremendous resistance to disease. So, and how this plays out, and Walter will talk a little bit more about this relationship with the cellular structure here, that this was in India after a cyclone, and on the right you can see the crop that was using this regenerative agriculture, the zero budget natural farming, and on the left it had all fallen over, the banana trees. And we have almost every morning, Walter and I in our WhatsApp group from India, we get photos like this of rice paddies and all different crops that have withstood storms and what winds, etc., and rains, that and also insect pressures because of their both structural integrity and also their nutritional integrity. Walter, do you want to talk a little bit about the
very quickly, very briefly? Yeah, well, obviously, but look, like us, the plants are resistant, have their natural resistance to pests, diseases, stresses, and the stronger the plants are, they're more resistant. And now, obviously, if they've got the right nutrition, if they've got these symbionts, if they're accessing the moisture, as we've been discussing, then you end up with much stronger cellular structures, a much higher turgor pressure, so that the cytoplasmic content of the cells are much, much higher, sugar, protein, and of course, they're able to resist infection, stress, everything. And so you can see that where the stressed, fast-grown, fertilized plants become extremely vulnerable to frost, to wind, to drought, to pest, to disease, whereas the natural plants are much, much more resilient. And it's like us, with us, like we make ourselves vulnerable through our diet, and then we shouldn't be worried. I mean, we shouldn't be surprised when, we become, because of that vulnerability, susceptible to disease and stresses.
Great, thanks. Oh, so as we're coming into a close soon, there's a question about how do we synthesize this information, really thinking about California and fire mitigation. Are there some steps that you would suggest that folks here who are working with, on the land, with people's land, what would you do specifically on the ground?
And this is wonderful. This is what we really came to, sir, because what we've been talking about, look, here's a whole toolkit, practices, case studies, science of hydrology, and all these wider options. But what we really need to then do is to say, right, what is California facing? What's the Russian River catchment facing in terms of fire threats? And then how do we look at applying this knowledge to design a resilience, risk minimization, avoidance strategy? And the first thing there in practical terms is, of course, you got to sit down with the people, discuss and talk and whiteboard and plan it. So it's not a textbook thing. What I was trying to illustrate with my fire versus fungi thing is there are a lot of wider options. And yes, we're actually applying that now, but it's, again, innovative. It's challenging a lot of the boys with toys and airplanes and tankers and all that. But basically, here's how nature avoids those fires. Can we, using less than 1% of the land, put these strategic biological swales in? And then you would look at that thing. And then the answer is not just the swales, of course. Then you were saying, okay, how do we enhance the fungal microbial breakdown of that fuel right across the catchment naturally? And then you'd be looking at, yes, what have we done to remove, for example, nitrogen sources that have changed the carbon nitrogen ratio of these things so the fuels aren't rotting down. If we've got forests growing at 20 tons of biomass per hectare per annum, then nature's designed systems that rot down 15 tons of biomass per hectare per annum, just to keep that nutrient cycling going. But if we've disturbed that and we're only getting 2 tons of nitrogen, 2 tons of litter breakdown and accumulating 10 tons, hey, where do we rebalance it? Comes a little bit back to that question earlier from Thomas, mulch and fires. See, this is the point. Yes, too much mulch without the mulch breaking down at all, you end up with a fuel. But if it's breaking down well, then it's basically turning into humates, which don't burn readily, they char. They're a bit like cork, they don't burn. So humates don't burn. And secondly, you're getting this metabolic water generated. So you end up with moister, broken down humate mulch beds. And quite frankly, there's very little combustible fuel there. And so there's always that balance, right? But it's not simple textbook prescriptions. It's a matter of sitting down, brainstorming, and then working out, yes, we can. We know that nature does it. We can as well. And we've got to avoid what happened across the next catchments across in Paradise 2 years ago, right? So it's an imperative. Yes, we must do this.
Great. Okay, I'm going to call on the team here. What do you think? Do we want to break into groups and let people process for a minute, or should we just take another couple of questions and wind up here?
Are there any questions from the audience? Yeah.
I don't think we have time for a breakout at this point.
Okay.
I was hoping to get Walter's take on landscape fabric still, if that would be okay, because that's something that I see in a lot of commercial landscapes locally.
No, appreciate. And this is a bigger challenge, isn't it? A bit like weeds in a way. It's sort of, here is an intervention. It's not natural. You really have to ask, what is the function that it's trying to perform? Is it essential, or are there other ways around it? And then what its benefits? So it's again, there's no dogma. It's just a question of, yes, is it essential? Is it developing a benefit? And is that benefit greater than its not having it? Are there natural alternatives? Classic case is a wicking bag. I have this discussion all the time. I'm saying, look, here's a wicking bag. We've got a sealed water container effectively built into each bag that enables us to only water it once every 30 days and use water very efficiently, right? Now we're using plastic. Plastic is basically solidified oil. Isn't that bad? And my point is that, yes, it's not desirable, but rather than having waste plastic just being disposed, here is a very clever way of harvesting that waste plastic, reusing it, recycling it continually. How bad is that vis-a-vis the food, the autonomy, the nutrition that it can give to urban communities, when we consider the urban communities are going to have a massive impact, embodied impact on the environment anyway. So yeah, look, it's a hard one there, Thomas, and it's a question of how much, where, for what benefit, and you'd really have to do it on a case-by-case basis, and accept that you can't always. The perfect mustn't stop the good, right?
I think a really key point here with the idea around the wicking bags is that, especially in a post-fire landscape, the amount of pollutants in the soil are tremendous, and using the wicking bags gives an opportunity to bring in soil from somewhere that was not so fire challenged, as well as simply creating soil from compost, and being able to grow food in the backyard without having to worry so much about that. And of course one can do that in a raised bed without the whole wicking bag, but in a water challenged landscape as well, the wicking bag helps with that. So and someone has pointed out, you may need to replace it more often, but certainly you can replace use a bioplastic rather than petroleum-based plastic. It would degrade a little quicker, but that could be an inner liner there as well. So.
Sure, and all you need is plastic is for the water containment. You don't need plastic for the whole thing. You can do that out of mesh or hemp or bamboo, or there's a whole lot of other options. It's a labor issue there. As far as your point about contaminated land, that's actually very important. See, lots of our land now is going to be contaminated. And so if we're going to grow food in urban agriculture, we've really got to separate the food growing soil from the contaminated soil. And yes, the wicking bags can do that, whereas a raised bed by itself can't, because the roots are still obviously going into that contaminated soil, but also all the roots from the contaminated soils will be desperately trying to get into your good soil because that's better soil, right? And so you're going to be fighting on two fronts. So yeah, look, horses for courses again.
Didi, Walter, I don't know, we don't have a lot of time, but just to maybe zoom out to the big picture in a little bit in our last few minutes, there's some interest in hearing your thinking on policy making. We have agencies and climate commissioners and others that are working on city and county climate plans, and they'll be listening to these presentations. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, look, I think that's why I really put this Charles Keeling thing up. That was 60 years ago that Charles sort of gave us that information. And the fact is, you see, we've been focusing on this 20 billion tons of carbon, the deficit, the fossil fuels. We've been ignoring the 250 billion tons of carbon every year. And it's in those 250 and our management of those that we have solutions. But really, it's a question of how do we frame the debate and the context of problem solving? And really, I think it's up to communities. And so this is where actually the grassroots communities are so critical. It's by doing it, by exploring, debating, raising these issues, and here are alternatives that we can bypass where otherwise we get stuck, as we have in the climate game, where we stuck on, just this fossil fuel emissions game and missing the bigger solutions in terms of natural land regeneration. So from a policy, yes, they're obviously very, very confined in terms of the space that they're working in. We have the degrees of freedom in the community to debate, to explore, to put in demonstrations, like Russian River Watershed, to say, look, here is a blueprint for rehydration for our watershed. And then the answer is, why can't this operate in 50 other watersheds all throughout California and the US, right? And I think the catalytic role of community action in this policy change is powerful. But certainly asking the status quo to innovate is an oxymoron. And that's where we've been. And in a sense, we haven't got the time anymore.
Thanks, Walter. And I'll just jump in with a couple thoughts as well. One of the things that we've seen both in Andhra Pradesh and in other places, like there's a group in Saskatchewan, and yeah, this is a widespread concept, but that when people can gather together in groups that regularly share their challenges, their successes, what's going on in their family lives, et cetera, and then learn from each other about what conference they just attended, what did they try, what's working. Those kinds of ongoing communities of practice or communities of support have a tremendous impact on people's ability to change what they're trying, change their behavior, and change a community's behavior. So in India, Vijay Kumar, who hosted our visit there, and he had 20 years ago or so been very, very critical crucial in terms of starting these women's self-help economic groups across India. I think there's something like 20 million or 70 million women all organized across India into these groups. And when Vijay then many years later understood that regenerative farming was a key piece of bringing India back, stopping the farmer suicides, regenerating landscapes, helping with water, etc. He thought, who better to bring this out than these women's self-help economic groups, because they already were organized. They already had taken on lots of really interesting projects together. And so they are the ones who rolled out this initiative in India that has engaged 800,000 farmers in one state in India, and that is on target to have an entire state in India be a natural farming. It's organic, regenerative, no pesticides, no synthetic fertilizers, nothing, no seeds bought from outside the village. And likewise, in Saskatchewan, this group of grazers that are friends of mine up there, they've been meeting for 17 years, this group of families that are all doing holistic plant grazing. And the first thing on the agenda when they meet is, does anybody have any really urgent business, whether it's cows out or a marriage falling apart? Then they get into like, what was the last conference we went to? Or how did that thing go that you were trying with your fencing? So the power of our relationships with each other is like those relationships of plants with each other or plants with their symbionts. We really need to be thinking about how to strengthen our relationships for so many different reasons. And that policy can then come from that, because then you have this whole web of relationships that are all thinking together. It's this idea that some expert, some academic, et cetera, is going to figure it all out and solve it. And that we can just sit and either praise or blame them. That A, makes leadership not very fun to do, because everybody's always commenting on what you're doing. That's a problem. We need to say we're all leaders. We are all working on making things go well around us, whether our efforts are recognized or not. But we do that best through relationships. So I want to close that out and say, yes, Andy.
Didi, that was a beautiful way to wrap up today, and I just want to extend a deep gratitude from our greater Russian River Watershed community. But I think we need to wrap it up, and I wanted to let everybody know, just like yesterday, we will also post today on our webpage. So you and your friends, if you want to see this again, you're certainly welcome to do that. But really appreciate the rich conversation and your insights from Walter Jehne and Didi Pershouse from yesterday and today. Really a Regeneration A team, if you remember Didi's triangle yesterday, and my brain sponge is saturated. If you enjoyed and benefited from this week's workshops, please let us know. If you have comments on how it could be done better, we'd like to know that too. It is imperative that we know how you feel and what you like and what you prefer, as it will inform what we bring forward in the future. Again, great thanks to our speakers, the Russian River Watershed Association's member agencies, in particular Sonoma Water and Santa Rosa, for the staff support and all the expertise to help pull this together. And I really look forward to connecting with everybody again, and wish everyone a safe and rehydrated rest of your week. And thank you, and I need to sign off, and thank you again.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Walter. Thank you,
Thank
Didi.
you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, for
This has
coming.
been great.
Really great group.
Yeah.
Such good
We
questions.
will be in touch with any possible next steps and continued conversations to come out of this very rich couple of days. I know it's just scratched the surface, so to speak. And so look forward to some communication regarding with the Russian River Friendly Landscaping Program. And thank you all very much.
Thank you, Walter and Didi. Amazing from Australia.
Thank you very much, Phil.